My name is Jonathan Kaplan. I'm the director of the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies here at UT Austin. I'm delighted to have all of you here for this first lecture in the Jewish Life in the Americas series for the spring semester. Before I turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Naomi Lindstrom, I want to highlight a couple of events that are coming up next week at the Schusterman Center on Monday that may be of interest to folks that are coming up. The first of these is Monday afternoon at 4 p.m. in Calhoun 516, where Andrew Lee Butters from the Moody College of Communications will be speaking with Dr. Ahmed Agbaria, who's our Israel Institute Fellow, on Israel's new far-right government and the Middle East conflict. So please mark that if you're interested in that topic at 4 p.m. on Monday. And then online on Monday evening at 7 p.m., we have a virtual opera screening, Eva and the Angel of Death, Holocaust Remembrance, which is a Holocaust Remembrance opera actually that emerged as a senior thesis project by a graduate of the Butler School of Music, Dr. Thomas Yee, and he will be with Aidan Feldkamp and Jacob Schnitzer, who also is involved in the production, showing a new movie that they did of the actual production of the opera, which happened this last spring. And this will be in honor of Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is actually this Friday, the 27th, which marks the 78th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. With all that ado, I invite you to check out our website for more information, where you can sign up to keep abreast of activities at the Schusterman Center and also learn more about these wonderful events. I'd like to turn it over now to my colleague, Dr. Naomi Lindstrom, who directs our Gale Collaborative on Jewish Life in the Americas.
Thank you. And for those who have arrived and haven't yet got any food, please help yourself. Welcome to today's event, sponsored by the Gale Collaborative on Jewish Life in the Americas, here at the Schusterman Center, the Teresa Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies, known as LILAS, and the Rappaport Center for Human Rights and Justice. And our speaker today, Ariel Dulitzky, clinical professor of law, director of the Human Rights Clinic, and director of the Latin American Initiative at UT Law School, a leading expert in the inter-American human rights system and in enforced disappearances. He was one of 5 independent experts of the United Nations Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances, which is to say desaparecidos. He was elected as a chair rapporteur, and prior to joining UT, he was assistant executive secretary of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. He's an honors graduate of the University of Buenos Aires, where he was editor of the Law School Review, and received his LLM from Harvard Law School, where he was an editor of the Harvard Human Rights Journal. So he's dedicated his career to human rights, with an emphasis lately on enforced disappearances, sports, especially since the Argentine victory in the World Cup has become a major concern of his, human rights, and on Judaism and human rights, in both his scholarly research and his legal practice. He has a record of active involvement in the promotion and defense of rights, particularly in the Americas and in international human rights litigations. Some of his recent publications include Rereading Cain and Abel, New Approaches to Enforced Disappearances, and the Latin American Flavor of Enforced Disappearances. He received the Gary Bello Public Service Award from Harvard Law School for his career in human rights. He was an advisor to the second edition of the Amnesty International Fair Trial Manual, member of the advisory panel for the revision of the UN Manual on Effective Prevention and Investigation of extralegal, arbitrary, and summary executions. So obviously a very distinguished career, and something that I'm very interested in. I've known Ariel for a long time. Of course, I've known that he was a human rights lawyer, and I've known that he was Jewish, but the two things didn't really seem to be formally connected until quite recently.
Correct.
I believe this happened during the pandemic. And so when he resurfaced, I noticed a lot of things about him had changed.
Yeah.
So I think we'll hear something about that. Well, thank you for joining us. The talk today, Cain and Abel and Enforced Disappearances, Reflections from an Argentine Jewish Human Rights Lawyer.
Thank you, Jonathan and the Schusterman Center for hosting me Thank you, Naomi. Naomi, as all of you know, is a wonderful colleague, always helping and opening spaces and opportunities. And I truly appreciate that. And whenever there is an Argentine coming, she always invites me to be present. So I'm, as Naomi was reading, I'm more an activist working in an academic setting rather than an academic person writing about activism. I'm, as Naomi said, I'm trying to explore and rediscover my own identity and redefining my identity. So the first half of my talk will be more a therapy session than an academic presentation. And the second part, when I get to Cain and Abel, it will be probably more academic, and then we will go back to the therapy session, okay? So, yeah, I was born in Argentina a couple of months ago. We have a talk about the gauchos judíos, the Jewish cowboys in Argentina. I'm a descendant of that. My name, as you know, Ariel, is a Hebrew name. But I, despite that my last name is Polish, my family is originally from Ukraine. I'm from Ukraine. They went to Entre Rios in Argentina. And when I moved here, probably you already discovered that they have a strong accent and nobody understands me, so I say I'm like the Little Mermaid with a Spanish accent, okay? And that's much easier for everybody to place me somewhere. So that was a part of my identity. I grew up in Argentina during the military dictatorship. Most of you probably know at least that between 1976 and 1983 there was a brutal dictatorship, very repressive, and among the worst human rights abuses were the use of the technique of enforced disappearances. At least 30,000 people disappeared during the dictatorship. Out of those 30,000, around 2,000 disappeared were Jewish. That is around 15 to 20% of the documented cases of disappearances, despite that the Jewish population in Argentina at that time was around 1%. So there is a huge overrepresentation of Jewish people who disappear. And among those who disappear are two cousins of my mother. The one on the left is Tilly Itzigson. She was a activist and union leader, and when the military forces were searching for her, they were asking about La Rusa. And for those of you who know about Argentina, every Jewish person, Ashkenazi Jewish person, is un ruso, una rusa, a Russian. Despite that, we come from all over the place. The person on the right is Tilly Neymark, another cousin of my mother. She was 31 years old when she was disappeared as a student of psychology, as half of the Jewish population in Argentina. Either you are a psychologist or you go to therapy. So far we don't believe that she was any type of political activist or anything, but she was living with somebody who was quite involved in politics, and we believe that that's the reason why she disappeared. Tilly, when she disappeared in 1977. She had two daughters, one was 3 years old, the other 6 months old, and her daughter really reconstructed her personal story and led the search for her and particularly in the last 10, 15 years, the search for justice and memory for her. In the case of Tilly, she didn't have any kids. She was divorced at that time. She was the only kid in her family. Her father committed suicide several years before she disappeared, and her mother did as much as she could. And really, I'm trying now to reconstruct her life. So Tilly is in part what guides me to my own soul searching. So from Argentina, I ended up here in Austin with a 2-year stop in San Jose, Costa Rica, where I was doing a lot of human rights work in Central America. From there to Washington, D.C. In 2007, I landed in Austin at UT. And in this journey from Buenos Aires to Austin, probably the only connection was one, that we like meat in both places, and two, that between the cowboys and the gauchos, there are some connections. But there was a first crash in terms of my identity. In this journey, when I was living in Argentina, probably I was El Ruso. When I was in Costa Rica, I was the Argentinian. And when I came to the States, I became a Hispanic or Latino with a female first name. So I became the Little Mermaid. But as a Latino, people assume that I have to dance salsa or bachata or eat tacos, but we have no clue about what's that in Argentina. We don't eat tacos. I don't even dance tango, and I cannot move at all. People, if I say that I'm Latino, they expect that I'm Perez or Gonzalez or Garcia or something like that, but not Ariel Dulitzky, correct? And when people listen to me, they don't understand where I'm from. Probably you realize that I have a strong accent in Spanish. For those of you who are familiar with Argentine Spanish, we sound more like Italian than anything else, and a lot of our slang are Italian words, and we use the vos instead of the tu. So it's a mess, correct? And because I'm Ariel Dulitzky, probably I don't face that much discrimination. When people see my CV or my name, they assume that I'm a Jewish woman from New York. So when they call me and I say, is Ariel Dulitzky there? And I say, yes, this is him. And there is an awkward silence for a couple of seconds. So, and then when I start to talk, that's where the discrimination and the problem comes. For me, these three words are exactly the same and sound exactly the same, and I cannot pronounce it, and I'm not going to try to do it. For you, it's, of course, they are completely different. For me, there are shoes, okay? And you try, depending on the context, you try to figure out which one of the three I'm referring to. And for years and years, I was fine with that. And when people laugh, as you laugh, and I laugh myself, I was fine with that. But there were a couple of things that started to bother me. One is this cup on the left top. That's the coffee that they gave me at the Starbucks that was at the stadium here. It's closed. When I said Ariel, they didn't understand, and they wrote alien. And that was several years ago. I laughed, and then when I got to my office, I realized that was really bad. I started to think, were they saying that I was a foreigner or somebody coming from Mars or something in between? And for years, because they couldn't understand what my name was, I started to say, I'm David. Okay, so that was much easier. Everybody would understand I'm not an alien. So that's fine. But I still, and this was almost 10 years ago, I still regret that I didn't complain with Starbucks at that point. And I realized that if myself as a law professor at UT with papers and everything was unable to react and complain at that time, what about the migrants that are in a much more vulnerable situation? And that started to really bother me, and especially as a human rights defender, I had spent my whole life working with human rights NGOs in different capacity, and now I teach the Human Rights Clinic that is basically a practical training for future lawyers. I've been doing this for the last more than 25 years. In fact, I now spend more time outside Argentina than in Argentina. And when I started to develop a crisis of identity, another one, and one of my mentors told me, "You are a boludo." That is, I don't know how you translate boludo in.
You're an idiot.
Well, you're an idiot. You are always going to be an Argentine. It doesn't matter for how long you live abroad. But really, and there is where Naomi was pointing, there were a lot of things happening in the last 5 years or so that really moved me. Sorry that I'm moving. That started to, everything that I already felt that I was having in place and kind of settled, and I was comfortable with a certain type of identity, everything went to hell, let's put it that way, okay? When my divorce, my father died 7 years ago, my kids graduated or are graduating from high school, leaving town between COVID and the snowstorm at home, the Russia invasion of Ukraine, exactly the places where my family is from. And when we read the news of Odessa, Kherson, that's where part of my family is from, and putting back 100 years later, the same type of war, oppression, despite that there is no necessarily anti-Semitism, but there still is the population of Ukraine suffering the same type of violence. Not to talk about politics, but the election of Trump for me was a representation of deeper social problems in America, where both my Jewish identity and my immigrant Latino identity were rejected by millions of people. So when I put all together, I'm there in my house, in my little apartment, and I started to think, okay? And I started to think, what do I do now? I'm frustrated, I'm in despair, I'm losing. So I started to think about, and okay, I'm tired of human rights, but I still like soccer, okay? So what do I do at UT that UT will keep paying me for doing what I like, okay? So I said, okay, now they will have to pay my subscription to ESPN because I watch sports and I will start teaching sports and human rights. So that's part. But that was not enough because there is a limit of how many soccer games you can watch in a day, correct? So I needed more. And I felt that I needed to go deeper in my search. And going deeper in my search, I started to become more spiritual. And more spiritual and more assertive of my own Jewish identity. While for years and years I was Jewish, if you look at my nose and the stereotype, look at my profile, look there. In Argentina, everybody knows that I'm Jewish. If you read my name, my last name, you know that I'm Jewish. But it was just a matter of fact that I really didn't work much to assert that. And when I started to, with all these things happening, I started to feel more compelled, not only to laugh at by being alien, but to appropriate my Jewish identity. and put it at the forefront of both my personal life and my academic work. And I started to do a search, and in this process, there was one word, a biblical word that appears 13 times in the Torah that guided my reflection, and is hineni, here I am. And that word is the idea that when Adonai, God, asked many times, where are you, Ayeka? And it starts with Abraham, the response is hineni, here I am. And the here I am is both the here and the presence. It's not only the physical presence, but also the spiritual, and the only way to be assertive of that presence is when I can see the face of the other. Because I'm saying, I'm here, or here I am, in relation to somebody else. And the only way for me to say hineni is to see the other and assume my responsibility to the others. And when I started to read about that and struggle with this concept that I needed for being present and say hineni, suddenly this idea of presence, this idea of presente, is the same message that people say when we name the disappeared. In any public event in Argentina, when we say we name Tilly Itzigson, and everybody responds presente. And for me, there was a connection between that, here I am, this hineni, and this presence. And this idea of Ayeka, where are you, is the same question, where are the disappeared? And the presence is the response to that we bring back the presence of the disappeared. And suddenly I started to unpack everything. And I started to unpack everything, and I became obsessed. As I became obsessed with soccer, I became obsessed with Cain and Abel. Why? Because Adonai asked Cain, where is your brother? And the question is the brother, but it's the question about where are you? And when he asked the same thing to Adam and Eve in the first chapter, they don't say, here we are. They are hiding. And Cain, with the same question, I don't know, am I my brother's keeper? They don't respond in any. And for me, that started to unpack how I think about enforced disappearances. And I started to read it, and then I read, well, I'm trying to get a biblical story to do a legal analysis. Clearly, the story is not a legal story. But some people talk about, oh, there's a court drama because there is a killing, and then God come and say, what did you do? And, oh, you are guilty, now I will punish you and go out of here and walk, and in 7 generations somebody will do something to you, and you will have the mark that you are guilty, and all that. So suddenly I can start to unpack that from a legal perspective. But the legal perspective is much more complex than my human rights law approach. So I needed to go back and start to keep reading Cain and Abel and the different interpretations in order to rethink about enforced disappearances. And I started to make crazy connections. So when Cain kills Abel, the first thing that happens is they say Cain tells to his brother. And that's one of the interesting things. If you read Genesis, Abel's name appears only once or twice. And the idea is always your brother, your brother, your brother. And it's in relation of Cain to the brother. And when we talk about the disappear, their names, their identity were erased. And if they were killed and they were buried in mass grave, they were buried under NN, no names. And so the idea of the known names, similar to the known name of Abel, started to another twist there. And another twist, but where is your brother? And in an E, and here, and present, there is something calling for bringing back the presence. And when he takes Abel, he says, let's go to the field. And if we read the Torah, when we say, let's go to the field, it's always a secret place. The idea that there are no witnesses. And the same thing with the secret detention centers. No witnesses. We know when they go, and then we don't know what happens there. In fact, we know that Cain kills Abel, but the Torah doesn't say how he killed Abel. The Torah doesn't say what happens with the body. The Torah doesn't say anything about how, what they discuss about, how he was killed, and how the body was disposed. And this is exactly the same as enforced disappearances. So we need to think, but it's not exactly the same. I started to think how Cain is expelled. He says, God says you have to leave, and he becomes a wanderer and start to travel around whatever was a known world there. And that resonates with the idea that we develop in Argentina not only the practice of enforced disappearances, but also the responses. And how this same wanderer and this story of Cain and Abel that 2,000 years later we keep retelling and rethinking is the same way that the Argentine experience started to travel around the world. And you see the pictures in Argentina, the mothers wearing the scarf with their names, suddenly they are in Turkey. 30 or 40 years later, with the same, who is working on expressive representations. I don't know if this counts as expressive representation, but at least wearing a scarf and using pictures and things like that became the symbol, the universal symbol of disappearances. And particularly in the case of Argentina, one of the things that happens is that these pictures are the only ones who remain young. We all get older except the pictures. And the pictures are always in black and white. Because in the 70s, there were very few color pictures. Most of them were the passport documents picture, not all of them here. You have the wedding, but that idea that we got the disappear, get stuck in the past, but are brought to the present, resonates with the time and how the meaning of the Cain and Abel, despite that the story is the same, the picture remains the same, the interpretation, the reactions, the opposition, the challenges against enforced disappearances evolve throughout time. There are other things that are similar to enforced disappearances and Cain and Abel. This is, according to the Torah, the tree, the family of Cain and Seth. But look at Abel. Look at Abel. And when the Torah says, your brother's blood, the Torah says blood. It doesn't say your brother blood cries out from earth. It's telling us that it's not only Abel who was killed, but it's all their descendants There are none. So the impact goes beyond the direct victim. And this is something that forced me to start thinking, what's the impact of disappearances throughout generations? What happened with that? And usually we talk about the mothers of the disappeared, the children of the disappeared, but now we are 40 years after the disappearances. What happened with the new generations? Did we lose them, or we are still connected to that? So I'm rethinking about that relationship and the 7 generations that the Torah talks about. What's the impact of that? I already talked about where is your brother. Similar question, where are the disappeared? Where the disappeared are? It's the same. But this idea, in fact, during the dictatorship, every week a group of Argentine people which supported them went and stood in front of the Argentine embassy in Washington, D.C. with a banner saying, ¿Dónde está tu hermano? Where is your brother? And what brought me in part to think about Cain and Abel is the use of this story during the dictatorship by different parties. One was, where is your brother? But the military forces said, you cannot compare Cain and Abel with disappearances or with the war that we are conducting, because Cain killed his brother. But in Argentina, those who we are fighting against cannot be considered Argentinians. They are enemies. They cannot be your brother. So you are even more justified to kill them. And that was the rationale using the same story. Naomi helped me to recover Borges, one of the leading authors in Argentina. And he have 5, 6, 7 stories, poems, using the story of Cain and Abel. And one, a short story, is Cain and Abel eventually meet after many years, and they start to talk to each other, and Borges ends the story saying, I don't remember any longer if I'm Cain or Abel. That is huge. What are the implications for us? And for us as human rights lawyers? Are we Cain or Abel? Are we representing Abel properly, or do we need to think what our role is? And then, of course, you have the, am I my brother's keeper? And that question is supposedly, yes, of course you are your brother's keeper. Of course you need to protect your brother. But who is interrogated by that question? Who is our brother? And for me, that is not the question of my brother, my cousin. It's what did the Argentine society do while the disappearances were taking place? What did the official Jewish community do while those 2,000 Jews were disappeared? So I started to unpack the idea of bystander. Who is the keeper? Who is the brother? And in fact, when this interrogation happens, some rabbis interpret that the Torah basically is a question to God. Well, if you are God, why you didn't do anything? You were the bystander there. Well, I didn't know. Okay, I didn't know that you couldn't kill somebody. Or if you knock somebody with a rock or whatever he used, how did he know that he would kill Abel? So maybe the question of bystander is about God as well. And who is, in this picture, the bystander in enforced disappearances? So I start to unpack and look at what is happening in Argentina, that the civilians are starting to be tried, judged, convicted for supporting the repression. So judges are being convicted. Priests are being convicted. CEOs of some transnational corporations were convicted because in part were bystanders, but in part they supported or knew and didn't do anything. So we need to rethink more about who is responsible, who is our brother's keeper. And how am I doing with time?
Oh, fine.
Fine, great, excellent. And then, in this whole story, we start to conceive enforced disappearance is a crime against humanity. And what is a crime against humanity? Crimes against humanity, the idea is that we go and commit these crimes that are so bad that go to the core of humanity. That not only I affect the person who is killed or disappeared, but we attack with these crimes the whole humanity and the foundational values of humanity. It is so bad that Cain killed half of the human population. There were only 2 kids. He killed half. First genocide in history. Elie Wiesel said that. This is the first genocide in history, half of the human population, if we take the Torah literally. Is that enough to say this is a crime against humanity? And many say that the crimes against humanity, the idea is that we destroy the humanity of the victims. We don't consider them any longer human beings. The story of we cannot consider them our brothers because they are our enemies. So we strip them from their humanity. Others say, well, they commit these type of crimes. They stop being human beings by perpetrating these crimes. You cannot understand that a human being, a rational human being, could commit these grave abuses against another human being. So either the crimes against humanity is because the victim is stripped of their humanity, or the perpetrators, or both, and the impact. Well, with my hineni, I started to think, maybe that's wrong. Maybe both the perpetrator and the victim both keep their humanity. And the only way for Cain to be satisfied of killing Abel is by seeing Abel as his rival, as his human rival. He needs to see the humanity of his brother in order to accomplish what he wants. And it's the same here. In order for the perpetrators to keep abusing, they need to see that there is a human being being abused. So they need to keep that in order to exercise power, the power over another human being. So I started to rethink about this idea of crimes against humanity. The idea, the Torah doesn't say anything what happens with the body of Cain. No, Abel, sorry. We don't know the same thing. It's the same thing with the enforced disappearances. The parents, the siblings, the widows, they don't know what happened. They don't know the body. The difference is that in the Torah says later they had a third child, because Abel was killed. So at least the Torah says the parents knew that he was killed. That is something that the uncertainty and enforced disappearances doesn't provide that answer. We presume and assume that the disappeared were killed, but we don't know. We don't know. In fact, what is interesting is the Quran is the one that completes the story of Cain and Abel. In the Quran, it says that Adam and Eve didn't know what to do with the body, and they saw that there were some birds burying a dead bird, and that's how they bury Abel. So it's very interesting for me that that's the same story. We don't know that, and another religion, another religious interpretation of the same story comes up with the solution. In the Talmud, some rabbis start to follow the Quranic solution for what happened with Abel's body. I'm not going to, because I prefer to have more time for questions. I unpack the idea of the mark of Cain, the idea of the blood crying out, the idea of the eternal wanderer, the idea of my punishment is too grave. I cannot bear that. That's what Cain tells Adonai, God. What it means for enforced disappearances and the punishment of the perpetrators of enforced disappearances. If we look at all the human rights organizations in Argentina, they ask for the harshest punishment against the perpetrators. Something that in the rest of the context they will say, no, don't use criminal law in that way because it's too much. But for perpetrators, they lost seeing the humanity of them and come back as harsh as possible. The idea of the punishment is too great to bear, it doesn't sound with the human rights movement. Is that appropriate, or do we need to rethink about that? The eternal wanderer. This is Renée Eppelbaum, one of the Jewish mothers of Plaza de Mayo. Her 3 kids disappeared during the dictatorship, and the eternal wanderer. 30, 40 years ago, young Renée Eppelbaum, and how she is, and she's still walking. Every Thursday at 3 p.m., the mothers walk in Plaza de Mayo. They have done more than, I think that, I don't know, thousands of rounds. Since 77 up to today, now many walk on wheelchairs and things like that, and there are less and less. Vera Harach, Italian, emigrated to Argentina, 1939, just before the Nazis and Mussolini started to deport Jews, escaping from that. Her son disappeared. Maria Rus survived Auschwitz. Her cat disappeared. So this eternal wanderer and eternal repression and eternal crimes against humanity, they survived twice. And what do we think? What do we think about? The Torah says that Cain, when he was expelled, founded a city. Enoch. The first city that is mentioned in the Torah is founded and created by Cain, the killer. So the whole human society lives now in the city created by the perpetrator. So what do we do with our disappear? And the society that we construct with the perpetrators, with the survivors, with the relative, with everybody. We need to think about that. What's the society that comes out from these violent events? And then I start to unpack everything. The B'nai B'rith files one of the first complaints for the disappearance of my cousin to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Israel creates a kind of an investigative commission to find out what happened with the Jews disappear. In Argentina, there is a Jewish movement of human rights to complain about that. We have memorials in Buenos Aires and Israel for the Jews who disappear, for the victims of the bombing of AMIA, the Jewish headquarters in Buenos Aires, we say presented, the INENI presente, as in the case of disappear, and we keep asking AYECA. And I answer INENI. And this is my INENI today. I'm unpacking these 4 areas today. That's what I'm trying to write about, is why the whole books coming out in the last 5 years on the story of Jewish lawyers and international human rights law, why nobody includes the story of what happened with the Jews in Argentina during the dictatorship. 2, I'm trying to think more from the Jewish law, rather than from the Torah, from the Halacha, try to understand what's the response to enforced disappearances, and try to construct a more halachic response to enforced disappearances. I'm rethinking my human rights advocacy from this perspective of the INENI. How do I change my practice? And I want to tell the story of the Jews who disappeared during the dictatorship and how they influence all this. And in my personal, so we end up with the therapy. I'm not any longer Dulitzky, and I added Dulitzky Nymark to keep my cousins disappear in my own name. I still embrace the alien and Ariel, but I added in my place, in my map, Odessa and her son. That is where the Nymarks come from, rather than Ishmael, that is where the Dulitzky come from. And I embrace my Jewish identity. So there's going to be justice, and Tilly is looking at us and asking us, AYECA, where are you? And hoping that we will say INENI. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ariel, for this really extraordinary talk. I'm sure people have something to say to you about it. Questions or comments or things you'd like to add on?
So thank you for truly compelling presentation here. One thing I wanted to ask about is you mentioned the role of corporations. I just kind of got turned on to this by this recent book that came out called The Last Train to Auschwitz, about the corporate accountability of, in this case, the French rail company, basically.
Yeah.
And, they offer the sort of classic arguments in the alternative. Well, we didn't know what the cargo was. And if we did know what the cargo was, then we're actually an organ of the state, not a private company. And if we're not an organ of the state, then, we have a gun to our heads and we can't do anything about it. So I'm wondering how the conversation is developed on corporate accountability for the complicity, right, of corporations under the dictatorship.
Well, there are a couple different stories. One is direct participation by corporations. And there are cases against the Ford and a case against the Mercedes-Benz, that another in northwest Argentina is a sugar mill company that basically either they pinpoint the union leaders of their companies and they tell the dictatorship, these are the troublemakers. That's one. In the case of Ford, it appears that there was a small detention center at their plant. So that is, it's impossible to say, we didn't know what was happening. Then there is more who provided the economic support, who were complicit and provided economic support, who there is also the whole complicity about Israel and selling arms to the dictatorship. But there were some private corporations selling arms as well, because Carter, remember that that time is Carter in the US, so there is an embargo for the human rights abuses in Argentina. So, and then it's more the bystander. Right. So, and the economic elite that was benefiting from that, but didn't do anything, or provided ideological or social support to the dictatorship. So that is more a moral responsibility rather than asserting the legal responsibility.
Thank you very much.
Hola.
Yeah, this was very interesting. I have two different types of questions. The first
Sure.
one has to do more with the concept of the idea of identity
Mm-hmm.
and how we can see that, through the lens of historical change.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking about many of the political activists during the dictatorship in Argentina
Mm-hmm.
and how there was this Jewish community who was very much inclined to a project of social change that was broader and
Correct.
that had a lot of like alliances that implied a different idea of identity politics.
Correct.
Right? I am just thinking about how they kind of like make alliances with unions, with sectors of teachers, with
Correct.
workers, and in that sense, just thinking about particular cases, how would they negotiate their Jewish identity with this more kind of like transnational project of social progress that was embedded in socialism and communism in certain cases, right? And that was then crushed and, by, like a larger political agenda that was not only Argentina,
Correct.
but as Uruguay and Chile,
Correct.
etc. Right? So that's the first question. The second question has to do about the type of enforced disappearances. The case of the military dictatorships in the Southern Cone, like affected so many people and sectors, right? But like the intellectual class was fundamental, and in that sense, we could build a memory because it triggered a commotion, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm thinking about the disappearances of undocumented immigrants in the U.S.-Mexico border, where there is no such identity.
Correct.
And that there are so many nationalists and by the people who don't have the slightest possibility of achieving rights.
Correct.
And in that sense, my question has to do with international law, because when people say like, who killed this person, or who killed that woman, or who knows, because we don't know if it's Mexican, we don't know if it's Costa Rican, and the case with the kids, right? So that question has to do more with the legal aspect.
Correct.
And
Yeah. Okay. That's what happens when you open the floor. While you are talking, you control the speech, but then the challenges come. So on the first, on the identity, that's an excellent question, and that's part why in my exploration on these comes that. First, because it's talking about the Jewish community or Jewish identity is not a monolithic identity. There is a split in the case of Argentina between the official Jewish community that are closer to the dictatorship, and in part they try to keep a low profile during the dictatorship with the idea if they go too much public, the harsher sectors, and there will be a public policy of anti-Semitism. While the question of the disparate numbers of Jews who disappear they were not disappearing because they were Jewish. They were disappearing mainly for their political affiliations, what you said. So they were not detained because they were Jewish. Except that once they were in detention, they suffered a harsher treatment. There was a lot of Nazi symbology in the secret detention centers. A lot of the type of torture that they suffer had a lot of anti-Semitic undertones. In terms of the ideology, there is a great article that is called When the Zionists in their way to Israel came across the Che Guevara. And they got stuck with Che Guevara and joined some of these political movements trying to promote social change. And they disappeared not because they were Zionists, but because they were following. But what is interesting is that because of this change in terms of the identity and why they disappear, and everybody agrees that or most of the people agree that they disappear not because of being Jewish, but then they receive a harsher treatment, comes a tension between the official Jewish community in Argentina and the official or the big Jewish organizations in the US. That the official organizations in the US want to take a harsher approach to the dictatorship. And they want to say there is an official anti-Semitic policy of the military regime. And the Argentine Jewish community is saying, please don't do it. And then suddenly comes this journalist, Jacobo Timmerman, who was detained. He comes out with this book, Prisoner Without Name, Cell Without Number, and saying, I was treated really harsh because of anti-Semitism. And that becomes a big scandal. So the Argentine community, Jewish community, is very upset. The American Jewish community is very happy because now finally have a survivor saying all that. Here, the Israelis from Argentina goes to Israel. Sabra and Shatila happens, the Lebanon war, and he had the wonderful idea of criticizing Israel. So from becoming a hero from this position of anti-Semitic, now this hero is criticizing Israel. We don't like him anymore. So there is a whole change. The Argentine Jews or the official Jewish community were telling you, we tell you that this guy, we cannot trust him on what he's saying. So there is a whole mess and enters the dynamic of that. Crash. Then there is the whole thing, okay, they were these socialists, leftists, all that. They were not doing anything with the Jewish community. Why the Jewish community is going to protect them? We are not the brothers keeper of those who are not really assuming themselves as Jews, despite that the dictators saw them because they saw Ariel Dulitzky. Well, of course he is Jewish, even if I had no connection with. So it becomes all that. In terms of the immigrants and there are people working more from the non-legal aspect, saying the concept of enforced disappearances is not enough because it doesn't cover these type of situations. They disappear from the official account. They disappear from the state protection. They disappear because they don't have names. They don't have birth certificates. They died in the border, in the southern border here, and nobody collects their bodies, or they are buried with no names or anything. And when their relatives try to search for them, they have to do it in a different language, in a different country. They don't have documents. So it's a whole mess, no protection. My response is learn from the Argentine story. In 1976, there was no concept of enforced disappearances. It didn't exist. So people were struggling and say, oh, this is a kidnapping, this is torture, there is a killing, there is all these things together. And they started to push for the creation of this new concept of enforced disappearance. And then, okay, now that we have the concept, what do we do with that? So they started to push for the UN to create a mechanism, for the Inter-American Commission to create something. Then they say, okay, now we are searching. We want to know what happened. From searching, we want the bodies. When they realized that is not, they started to search for justice and say, now we want them to go to jail. When that is not enough, some said, give us money, pay compensation for the deaths. And then the mothers split and said, we are not going to sell our kids, we don't want money. Others say, we are suffering economically, financially because of the disappearances, we deserve economic reparations. Learn from that, the struggles and the evolution of the concept. And if the concept of enforced disappearance is not enough to cover the undocumented migrants, let's think about something else. Let's learn how the mothers 40 years later still keep walking and still demanding that. Think about money, who is looking at us. Let's think about the happy response from that. the law always comes late. We always come late. Something happens, and then the lawyers come and say, let's try to figure it out. And we will charge you a lot, except if you do human rights law, correct? So that's what we need to do. Yes, we need to finish.
Going back to this Borges story,
Borges.
the very, very short one.
Yeah.
The way it ends up, the two brothers are saying to each other, I can't remember whether I killed you or you killed me. And then Cain says, now I know that you truly pardoned me.
Mm-hmm.
And Abel says, as long as memory remains, that's when guilt remains.
Yeah.
And the sort of unpleasant way you could interpret this is the best way to get rid of guilt is for everybody to just forget the whole thing, forget it ever happened.
Yeah.
And my students always find this story quite disturbing. They don't go along with the idea of don't commemorate, just forget. Could you bring that up, the whole issue of memory?
Yeah, I think that.
Commemoration versus non-commemoration?
Yes, so one is the Torah says 7 generations. So the Torah is already telling you, you're not going to forget. And in fact, for 7 generations, the punishment will come then. But in order to bring that to the present, you need to remember. The whole Torah, I always say Pesach, Passover, the Avadim Ainu, slave we were. We don't say they were a slave, our ancestors. It's we were, we. So it's the remembering, but embracing that and acting upon that. Because it's we were slave, it means that we need to act today as if we were a slave, and we cannot slave somebody else, oppress somebody else. In Yom Kippur, when we say Ashamnu, or when we do the whole different prayers, it's always a collective acknowledgement of that. And they, Jewish historians, I'm not, but they say that it's the only place where history becomes part of memory in a religious service and calls for action. So it's not so much remembering as a monument. It's not so much remembering as a passive thing that we have a monument. It's remembering in order for us to think about what we are doing today with that historical event. What's the significance of that today? That's how, and that's why in part, I have a whole section in my article on memory, that I try to think about that more proactive way of thinking about historical events and past things. We have two there.
Just on this issue of the difficulty of memory and whether keeping it alive is productive or not. I mean, the go-to story for that in the Hebrew Bible is the story of Amalek, and the paradox of God commanding us to wipe out the name of Amalek and never to forget that our responsibility is to wipe out the name of Amalek. So if we can never forget that we have to wipe out the name of Amalek, then we can never wipe out the name of Amalek. So that paradox just seems to me to be, key in the Hebrew Bible altogether of wrestling with this issue of past wrongs.
I think it,
Wrestling with that issue of past wrongs and our it's community building in a way to say we're still going to remember that even though it's, we can see other things in that.
can you open the door? Yeah, and in fact, there is a book, probably the most complete story of the Jewish community, Disappeared Jews, is by Emmanuel Cain. The book in English is Memories That Lie a Little Bit, because now in this story, now we are always portraying the good, the bad, the question mark. And he tried to approach in a critical view and say, well, the Jewish community was in part reflecting the Argentine society. That's one. And now the heroes like the journalist, another journalist, Hermann Schiller and Nueva Presencia, in fact, they started to talk about the disappear in the late years of the dictatorship, not at the core of the most repressive part. And now they are suddenly the human rights champions. The Torah, the rabbis in the Talmud and in other pieces, when they interpret, they are not saying that Abel was such a saint. That's much more a Christian view of the story than a Jewish one. The Jewish one is much more complex. It appears that Cain was kind of, oh, God accepted my offering and not yours. You are a waste of time or whatever. Oh, you are this profession and not that one. That's why I'm much better than you. So they make this story much more complex. And that forces us to rethink about how we portray the disappear. Traditionally in Argentina and in most of the human rights world, the disappear are these innocent, nice victims with no political participation, no political affiliation, no using arms and killing people. All that was erased. The mothers don't say, my son disappeared because he was a montonero or a member of the guerrilla or whatever. So embracing the political identity, and that is changing also, is accepting that the victims are much more complex and that is recovering why they disappear and the social and political project that they were pursuing and what it means that today. And the elimination of the perpetrators, who are that? And for me, the question goes in part to the corporate approach and complicity. For me, it's not just the old military officers, and now he's in his 90s, and we will send him to jail for 15 years, 20 years, 40 years. That it means a death sentence because they will. For me, it's more who benefited from that. Who was supporting that? Who were the bystanders? And what happened with the society that we created? So the Amalek is that. That's what we need to eliminate. And it's not the figure, the individual figure. It's the social process. It's the social project and the political project and the consequences of how we constructed a society based on that. And for me, that's in part the memory, the Jewish memory calls for that. It's not just remembering. It's the actual remembering and the impact of memory today.
I was going to mention.
I keep going. I have no problem. But
I think this is probably our last question.
Okay, I was going to just make a comment about memory and just mention also the fact that a lot of the officials neglected to take records for very obvious, well, maybe not such obvious reasons, but definitely because in the absence of records, we don't get these complex stories of who these people are, but also it's easier to evade justice in the future. And so in reconstructing the stories through what you're doing and through what the Madres de la Paz are also doing in the repetition, is reconstructing those histories that are lost in the archives and creating an archive that can later be consulted for all the different reasons that those archives deserve to exist, and then sort of rage against that victor telling the story and having that last word. So I just wanted to make that comment across what you all were saying about memory.
And what we do today will be memory tomorrow. So the INENI, we are today, and what we are doing today, the justice efforts today, the memorials today, the truth seeking, the reparations, everything will be the memory of how our society the future society remembers our society and looks back to us. So it will evolve. And what we think that we are at the forefront of everything, it will be examining a critical view in the future, and probably what we believe makes sense today is not going to make sense tomorrow. The good thing is that our Jewish approach says that when there are two Jews together, there are always three opinions, correct? So we don't have the answer to that, but we struggle, and we struggle with the questions. And for me, that's more important. That's why I get frustrated in an academic setting, because I keep asking questions, and they ask me, and what's your theory? And I said, I don't have the theory. You struggle with my question and come up with your own solution. And always in my students' evaluations, I get really bad evaluation because the students say, we can understand Dulitzky because he keeps asking questions and we don't know what to say. And I'm happy with that, and I take that as a compliment, and they take that as a critique, and so. In Spanish, what the fuck? So, okay? With that, I have the last word. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for a really extraordinary talk. I think
thank
people
you.
will remember for a long time.
No,
Maybe not for Southern generations, but for a long time.
thank you.